History records that in 1542, Bartolome Ferrelo, pilot for Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, sailed as far north as the southwest coast of Oregon. Sir Francis Drake viewed the southern coast of Oregon in 1579. In 1603, Martin de Aguilar sailed up the coast and sighted a river which was later to be discovered as the Columbia River. And explorers continued to reach Oregon from the west by water until about 1807, 1806, when Lewis and Clark came from the east. The Oregon Territory was organized in 1848, and on February the 14th, 1859, Congress ratified the Oregon State Constitution. These early explorers caught visions of majestic and the rugged coast, of a spectacular gorge unfolding from rolling barren hills to a lush forest. And on reflecting on this, Oregon's birthday, in a gubernatorial election year, the program committee felt that we had a unique opportunity to hear from a man with a vision for Oregon who is not encumbered by the political realities that a candidate faces. We have asked Attorney General David Frohnmayer to address us on a topic we selected for him, If I Were Governor. As most of you know, Mr. Frohnmayer had considered entering the governor's race, but for personal family reasons, which he shared openly with the public, he decided not to file for the office. I would like to quote from a book, Habits of the Heart, on a section discussing community commitment and individuality. Public involvement is often difficult and demanding. To engage successfully in the public world, one needs personal strength and the support of family and friends. A rewarding private life is one of the preconditionings for a healthy public life. David Frohnmayer has given Oregon 11 years of public service, having first been elected to the Oregon Legislative Assembly in 1975. He is a native Oregonian, attended schools in Medford, and then attended Harvard College, graduating cum laude in government in 1962. A Rhodes Scholar, he attended Oxford University, earning a bachelor's degree in 1964. He later obtained a master's from Oxford in 1971. And in between earned his law degrees from the University of California, the Boalt Hall, in 1967. David Frohnmayer has served in positions at the federal level with the Departments of Health, Education, and Welfare and the Justice Department. He taught at the University of Oregon Law School and served as counsel to the president of the University of Oregon. He served in the Oregon House from 1975 until 1980, when he was first elected Attorney General. Please welcome Oregon's Attorney General, David Frohnmayer, who will share with us, at our insistence, his vision for Oregon.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and it is a genuine pleasure to address this distinguished forum on the occasion of Oregon's 127th birthday. In a crossroads election year, it is a time and an opportunity to engage in the art of forecasting and in the special self-indulgence of giving advice. Crossroads year it is. The next gubernatorial term will see, I believe, and give us the choice whether we will fulfill Oregon's proud heritage as the land of the empire builders or find ourselves increasingly a declining economic colony, a sad domestic variant of the third world. Forecasting, of course, is an art and should be accompanied by appropriate disclaimers. You should know that in 1979, remember that year, I acted as program chairman for my service club, and my distinguished guest economist speaker and I agreed that his uplifting topic should be, and in fact it was delivered, on the subject, why the Willamette Valley will be spared in the coming economic recession. And of course you must consider the source. Winston Churchill was once asked to state the qualifications for a politician, and without hesitation he said, "It is the ability to foretell what will happen tomorrow, next month, next year, and to explain afterwards why it did not happen." Advice, of course, we all freely give, In Attorney General circles, there's the famous story about the rookie Attorney General who had beaten his opponent in a very badly contested race, and then the incumbent literally left nothing in the office but a chair and a table. But in shaking hands going out the door, he said, "I did do you a favor. In that desk drawer are 3 envelopes which you can consult, but don't open them up. They're numbered unless you're seriously in trouble." Well, 6 months went by and there was no problem because the public official, the new AG, had his honeymoon period. But all of a sudden he was greeted by the press at his door and they said, "Why did your assistants fail to meet the filing deadline? The state's in a $100,000 default in a major case." He didn't know, but he quickly retreated to the desk and opened up envelope number 1, and it just had 3 words. It said, "Blame your predecessor." So he went out and denounced his predecessor and received editorial accolades because it really wasn't his fault. 2 years later, the cost overruns that were exposed in the building of his regional offices were more serious, and again the press was waiting outside, the television Klieg lights were on. He had no quick answer, and so he raced to the desk with some greater degree of comfort, opened the envelope, 3 words, said, "Reorganize the office." So he called in the press and drew a new organization chart on the board, and they went away satisfied, and again he was praised for being a man of vision and a great manager. Finally, about 3 weeks before the hotly contested election, when he was running for re-election, he was called up at 5 o'clock in the morning by a reporter for the state's leading metropolitan daily who said, "Why is it that your 2 top aides were just indicted in a gambling scandal at the racetrack?" And he didn't know, so he raced down to the office, and with shaking hand he opened the door, and he raced to the desk, and he opened up the 3rd envelope, and there were just 3 words. It said, "Prepare 3 envelopes." That story actually plays in the organization of my remarks today because everything in the universe, and particularly in this year's gubernatorial election, seems to come in groups of 3, as of course will the themes of my remarks. These remarks also have a beginning, a middle, and an end, although perhaps not in that order. By the way, my proposition that everything comes in 3s is subject to self-evident proof. There are those of us who believe that everything in the world comes in 3s. There are those who don't, and there are those who don't know. Our separation of powers government has 3 branches. There are 3 major announced candidates for governor, and those 3 candidates are all 3 lawyers. By the end of this campaign year, you may learn to understand the true meaning of the curse employed by the ancient Chinese when confronting their bitterest enemies. They would always conclude, "And may your life be filled with many lawyers." Well, what's the diagnosis? What's the matter with Kansas? What's the matter with Oregon? Just before the turn of the century, in the turmoil of the populist revolt, William Allen White wrote his masterpiece denunciation of Kansas state politics. In that now classic article of American journalism, White derided the state's leaders. That old moss-backed Jacksonian who was running for governor, the shabby, wild-eyed, rattle-brained fanatic who was running for Chief Justice, the hoop skirt of a man who'd failed as a businessman and an editor and a preacher and who was running for Congress, and the kid without a law practice who they now chose to vote for Attorney General. That last one comes a little too close. But the themes have a ring in the words of contemporary editorialists and indeed in our street talk. The fault somehow lies with elected leaders failing personally to exercise leadership. We exist in an unparalleled era of public official bashing. Our society seems bent on and engaging in a national orgy which I call bag the leader. And the decreased tolerance for the mistakes of leaders and leadership is not limited to politics, obviously. It's witnessed in the sharply shortened tenure of academic deans and university presidents, corporation executives, union officials, church leaders, and apparently even Statue of Liberty Commission members aren't safe. The germ of authenticity in this attitude, of course, is that in recent lifetimes government officials have made terrible mistakes that are costly. Vietnam, Watergate, and closer to home, the largest dry hole in the history of public works, the $7 billion whoops fiasco. The flaw in the model, though, is a dangerous one. It lies in the assumption that a simple change in the rider will fix our problems, and that salvation awaits us if we follow a new leader in shining armor astride a white horse on the road to Damascus. The second theory finds tragic flaws in institutions or programs as the source of our discontents. Just more programs or a lot fewer programs depending on whether you occupy the left or the right hand of the political spectrum, then becomes the solution. I call this the pill-popping alternative. We're captivated by the miracles of modern medicine and by the enticements of drug advertising. We're led to assume that there's an easy institutional quick fix to these problems. But the flaw in that analysis lies in the hard truth that all the easy problems have already been solved. There is, of course, a third theory. The fault lies not with institutions or leaders, but with the American people, or closer to home, with the citizens of Oregon themselves. The best example of this is probably found in the low point of Jimmy Carter's beleaguered presidency. After summoning more than 100 leaders to the sanctuary of Camp David, the president solemnly announced to us that the source of our national ills was the malaise of the American people. In an unkind moment of partisanship at the time, I subtitled that address, "Jimmy Carter Discovers Existentialism." But we see some truth in this too at home. The inability of the Oregon legislature to resolve tax reform questions faithfully mirrors the distrusts and discontents of our own voters on any program that involves major tax shifts or tax changes. And it has been so for decades. Politicians wouldn't promise the impossible if people didn't expect it. The truth, of course, lies in some combination of all these three theories. Some leaders have failed us. Many institutions are in drastic need of reform. And obviously a closer social consensus on major priorities would simplify our collective lives and certainly cure the Excedrin headaches of our elected leaders. When Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was in his twilight years, so the story goes, he found himself on a train confronted by a conductor, and Holmes looked for his ticket, but with increasing irritation couldn't seem to find it. But the conductor recognized this distinguished jurist and said he needn't bother, he just could mail in the ticket when he got home. With rising annoyance, Holmes looked up to him and said, "The problem is not where my ticket is, the problem is, where am I going?" Where we are going is the fundamental problem which Oregon's next governor must understand and what any successful campaign must help to define. What are Oregon's mega trends? How can we better understand them? How can we capitalize them? And beyond that, how can we make our future? Who are the risk takers who count? How can we support them? And in some cases, how can government simply get out of their way? There are three major issues on Oregon's top agenda. Not surprisingly, in view of the themes of this speech, there is a three-part formula to resolve each of them. The issues are economic revitalization, strengthening our educational system, and dealing with major problems in our criminal justice system. The solutions have a stark simplicity about them which disguise how challenging the task actually is. And they are: deal from your strength, develop a plan, and execute that strategy. Before I speak to each of those issues, let me say why the formula for those solutions is so critical. Because if we do not deal from our strengths, we will end up chasing will-o'-the-wisps. The politics of slogan, quick fixes, and pill-popping solutions will dominate our political dialogue. If we do not develop the strategies, we'll dissipate our limited tax resources, we'll march to 1,000 different drummers, and we'll immerse ourselves in an orgy of finger-pointing when our strategies and plans do not work out, because in fact we have no long-range plans on many of those critical issues. And if we do not execute our plans and follow through on the decisions that we do make, we will fuel the disenchantment of our citizens, we will waste scarce tax dollars and human energies, and we will continue the practice, too often observed in government at every level, of changing the menu or even canceling the meal before the salad course is even served. The point of this all is that this is no time for ungifted amateurism in the business of government. There's a story about the fellow who read one book on skydiving and decided to go out to the airport, and he rented a couple of parachutes and went over to McKenzie Flying Service there in Eugene and said, "Take me up to 5,000 feet. And the pilot said, "Well, do you know anything about this?" And the guy said, "Yeah, I read a book." And the pilot said, "Well, okay, you pay your money." So he flew him up to 5,000 feet, turned the plane on its wing, the guy dropped out, and he reached him back, because on page 7 it said the chute's there and back, and he pulled the ripcord, and a piece of rope about this long came out in his hands, and he started falling farther and farther. And finally he said, "Well, see, on page 32 it said that there's a reserve chute," and so he looked in front, and sure enough there was a ripcord there, so he pulled that, and a piece of silk about this long came out of his hand and fluttered in the breeze, and that's all that happened. And he started falling faster and faster toward the earth and got really worried until all of a sudden he saw a guy coming up from the ground toward him, and they got close enough, and finally he said, "Hey," he said, "do you know anything about parachutes?" The guy said, "No." "Do you know anything about propane stoves?" And so that's why something more than a bright idea and a quick fix is what we ask for. So let's turn to the issues, and let's talk about economic growth, because we are emerging from an economic disaster in which Oregon's unemployment rate was exceeded only by Puerto Rico and Michigan. The human consequences of the other Oregon, the one that lies outside Portland's downtown in the Sunset Corridor, have been wrenching. Empty storefronts in Coos Bay and Eugene, beached fishing vessels in Astoria, Florence, and Newport, mill closures in Oak Ridge, and unemployment lines in Enterprise and Joseph. Economic deprivation fuels discontents, from the struggling single parent to the elderly citizens trying to meet their fuel bills to the student who can't continue an education. I never met a logger who wasn't proud to be a logger, but you can't say the same thing about a person who doesn't have a job. And in the midst of it, we've asked governments to take on helping tasks when declining tax revenues couldn't pay the bill. The resulting political fallout has been predictable and unseemly. Too many piranhas, not enough meat. To paraphrase that captivating and simple Safeway slogan, our folks want to work an honest day, and they want an honest deal. An honest deal that extends beyond the supermarket shelves into the halls of their government. If I were governor, I would say, never again. I would help rebuild Oregon's economy from our strengths. Oregon is still the best place in the world to grow trees. And if our planning does not nurture the forest products mainstay of our economy, it is no planning at all. Contrary to the sayers of doom just a few years ago, recent expert studies are heartening. Our Canadian competition is not invulnerable and may indeed wane. The forests of the southeast are overcut and their regrowth has diminished. And a reduction in the national debt, a release of housing demand, or both promise better markets in the years ahead. But we must be poised and ready. And that means continuation of our forest research, market development, better waste product utilization, use of the hardwood byproducts, I suggest furniture instead of just firewood, and assistance in the high-tech retooling of that industry to make it competitive when it comes back online. If I were governor, I would deal from our strengths in high technology and support those who understand it. And parenthetically, to understand how recent that is, today, in addition to Oregon's birthday, is the 40th birthday of the computer. Oregon, our strength, is the third fastest growing high technology state in the country and the 9th total overall in the growth of high-tech firms. And we need to build on that base and its synergistic energies. But there's a danger call in that little slogan, that siren call, that may cause us to construe it too narrowly, because high technology is more than just the Silicon Forest. It is also biotechnology. At the Health Sciences University at the Hill and at the University of Oregon Institute for Molecular Biology just 100 miles upriver, scientists known the world around are probing the very secrets of life at the genetic and molecular level. The spin-offs into life-saving medical technologies and beyond that into a million and billion-dollar healthcare industry are almost impossible to imagine, but their potential is enormous, and we are seated, and that is our strength, and we should expand on it. And it is also high technology in plant genetics. And again, we needn't look farther than the Oregon State University, which is a world leader in exploring new avenues that have immense contributions to make in lumber and in agricultural products, Oregon's mainstay generally. If I were governor, I would address a fundamental oversight, because you see, Oregon has no overall economic development strategy. Programs are not strategies, and the fight over Oregon's lottery dollars proves it. Without a strategy, that cornucopia simply becomes the catalyst for regional jealousies, legislative pork barreling, and intergovernmental bickering. As part of that strategy, I would ask for a quick inventory of every single law that now acts as a barrier to economic growth and expansion. And I would consider a careful and time-limited but comprehensive exceptions process to give a window of breathing room to new or expanding enterprise. And if I were governor, and I say with caution, for the right motives rather than the wrong ones, I would explore a mid-course correction of Oregon's land use planning laws. Their noble purpose is in danger of becoming too fossilized, too trivialized, and too legalized. Too fossilized because they paralyze decision-making and threaten to drown concern for outcomes in an endless sea of procedure. Too trivialized because they threaten to turn every decision of government into a land use decision. Too legalized because the arcane and mystic language of that particular law has made the land use process accessible only to the likes of the Thousand Friends of Oregon, Department of Justice attorneys, the appellate courts, and a few brave officials of local government and the LCDC. That transformation threatens both citizen access to the process and the political legitimacy of the entire program. To conclude this part, let's count our blessings. We don't have the mountains of toxic waste in this state that our sisters to the east do. We have abundant water, albeit sometimes in the wrong places and the wrong times. We have enormous resources, too rich to recount. We don't yet have the hazards of acid rain. We don't have the 200-year overwhelming decay of our infrastructure, though that in itself is a significant problem. And unbeknownst to almost everyone, we have achieved for the first time in decades a favorable state balance of trade with expanding overseas markets on the Pacific Rim. If I were governor, I would pay attention to education and I would deal with our strengths. Because education is a fundamental value to Oregonians, shared so deeply that it is hardly necessary to articulate it to an audience such as this. Despite its starvation, we have a first-rank state system of higher education. And we have dedicated teachers and administrators at every level from kindergarten through the community colleges. But we need new strategies. We still have dropout rates that are unacceptable, approaching 30%. We have a system of educational financing that is cruelly designed to pit the waning incomes of the elderly against their grandchildren's educational future. We lack the close ties of our educational institutions to our economic development strategies that is so apparent in those states that have been successful. And we will be forced probably to deal with steady state resources rather than increasing budgets. Beyond that point is the issue of the human values that we expect from our system. Because I hope that we ask for more than simple computer literacy from the next generation. We need something more than simply an Apple IIe in every classroom. The studies by the Carnegie Institute of Higher Education show some alarming trends of the recent graduates of our American collegiate system. Those studies, which include students in the Oregon system, demonstrate that in their attitudes, at least 60% of them believe that the world that they inhabit will be far worse than that of their parents. And yet a full 80% of them believe that they personally, materially, will be far better off. It's as though they want to go first class on the Titanic, the author says. Or at least each one of them to carve off his or her own personal lifeboat from the Titanic. There is such a drop in civic commitment that the author of that study found initially that only 5 out of 100 believed that government at any level could do any good for anyone at all. And while that trend line on the recent surveys is far more positive, it still indicates an alarming loss of civic values that has been one of the central points of our system. And certainly if we're looking for a generation of future leaders, that has to be part of what we ask. And that brings us to the execution of the plan. I would ask each of our community colleges and each of the institutions of higher education to give a specific 4-year plan as to how their institution would serve the needs of the state of Oregon. I would demand a consortium approach by post-secondary education. With steady state resources, we simply cannot afford to go it alone, and yet with the combined brain power that we have on all of our institutions, that I believe is the wave of the future. I would consider a new and model departure, a 2-year state residential school for the state's talented and gifted teachers and students, encompassing persons from all regions, all social groups. It would be a magnet for the study of education, a magnet for new technology, a laboratory to perfect what we already know, and I profoundly believe that we know most of the things that make good education and good teaching. It's the catalytic effect of having them together. I believe that would be a major way to halt the dropout rate, which amongst the talented and gifted of this state and nationwide approaches 30%. It would halt the brain drain of those students from this state to other institutions out of state when they go to college. And it would be a showpiece to show commitment to higher education. I would ask every school district to loan us its best and its brightest at regular intervals and on a rotation basis so that we learn how to teach and how to learn better. And lest you think this is a utopian dream, let me tell you that it has been one of the most successful parts of the economic development and education programs of the state of North Carolina. If I were governor, I would be concerned about the problem of personal violence in this society. Crime, if statistics are accurate in predicting, will victimize 1 out of 3 of you this year in some form, and 16% of those victims will be victims of violent crime. It is no surprise, therefore, that 4 of the top 10 citizen concerns on our annual serious crime survey consistently relate to problems of the criminal justice system. This is not a jingoistic appeal to fear, but I do confess hearty agreement with Professor Joseph Bishop of the Yale Law School, who recently said that the incarceration of even the most obviously guilty criminal is a task comparable to landing a barracuda with a trout rod and a dry fly. That issue relates to something more intangible, more directly to something that we call personal security, which is, after all, the central purpose for which we form civil governments. And I see 3 issues in search of a strategy. The first one of them is jail and prison overcrowding. We need to develop better predictors of violence so that those are incarcerated are appropriately incarcerated. Beyond our votes for Measure 5 in the spring, we need to work on meaningful alternatives to incarceration. Drug and alcohol abuse are a central part of this issue, and if you are really looking at changing the face of this state in terms of the level of violence that we direct against one another, we need to look at those issues in the cold light of realism. 50% of the incarcerated felons, in a recent study of Oregon, which replicates national studies, admitted to using one or both, that is, alcohol or drugs, before the commission of the crime for which they were incarcerated, and that figure was even higher for robbery, rape, and murder. Heroin, which is near epidemic in some places in this valley, is consistently implicated in serious and violent crime. The strategy obviously has to be twofold: interdict the supply and decrease its demand. Obviously, I've just put another task for our schools and for our volunteer sector and for our public-spirited citizens. But that is an issue which deserves the visibility that it has because it is so closely tied to the quality of life that we want to enjoy. And then something else, it is a discovery that we need to trumpet far and wide because it leads to one of the most serious and formerly hidden social problems that exists in our society, and that is the serious and epidemic problem of child abuse and molestation. A survey of inmates in the Oregon State Penitentiary recently demonstrated that 30 to 60% of them had suffered moderate to serious child abuse as children. The chance that a person who has been abused as a child will grow up to be a criminal is 8 times greater than that of someone who has not been subject to that abuse, because obviously they have learned to communicate through the language of violence rather than the language of love, and in a grim way have fulfilled the ancient biblical prophecy that the sins of the fathers will be visited on the children. And so if we had a strategy to deal with the issue of child abuse and molestation in a way that would really interdict that problem, we could in 10 years, I believe, have the crime rate in this state. If I were governor, I would direct the Attorney General, or on second thought, I would respectfully request the Attorney General to canvass every law that could conceivably help children in need of protection. I would ask for a report on ways in which new law changes could protect the dignity of child witnesses in courtroom proceedings. And I would ask that office, together with the Children's Services Division and every other part of the volunteer sector that deals with these problems, to develop comprehensive and adequately funded programs for treatment and education so that this scourge can be removed from our society. Now, I've not described a job that will be easy. A governor can't do it alone, and we certainly don't need a soloist. We need an orchestra conductor. So I'd ask for help. I'd ask this city club, the Oregon Business Council, the Oregon Graduate Center, our universities and our chambers of commerce to join in the urgent priority of economic growth. But I'd focus the effort on a coordinated action plan, and I'd reject an endless debating society. I'd ask for our teachers' associations and our education community to develop the plans and execute the strategies for education as partners in knowledge, not adversaries seeking advantage at the bargaining table. I'd ask our law enforcement officers, our victims groups, our schools, and yes, our criminal defense bar, to lend aid, support, and insight to long-term focused efforts on crime prevention. And if I were governor, I'd make sure that state government was up to the task. I'd try to catch public employees doing things right, rather than denounce their existence. The greatest failure of government, in my judgment, is its inability to build a stronger middle management. If that takes more flexible personnel policies, as I think it does, I'd ask the legislature to help us reward creativity and establish career ladders, rather than lock us in a system which has temptations to bad management or overspending or agency misbehavior. I'd look hard at whether all of the centralization we have in Salem continues to serve our needs for every function of state government, or whether some of them could be more effectively accomplished at a regional level. I'd rethink, but not endlessly, how every function of government is organized, bearing in mind, of course, that our organization has been around yesterday's priorities and not tomorrow's. And I'd work with legislative leaders to establish a commission on the legislative branch, the only one of our three branches of governments that has not had a comprehensive internal-external look. And certainly in view of the sad decay of public confidence in that institution, I believe that that would be an important point of departure for renewed public confidence in all of our branches of government. In all of this, I hope I would not get greedy or create expectations on which I could not deliver. I'm reminded of the story of the two Presbyterian ministers who finally made it to heaven after leading meritorious lives. There wasn't quite enough room there yet, St. Peter told them. So he said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to grant you any wish you want. You can go back to earth and be the thing you've always wanted to be for just 2 weeks until it opens up. And so the first minister came up and he said, you know, I remember the Old Testament and it speaks about soaring with the wings as eagles, and I'd really like to be an eagle. Poof, he's gone. The second minister stepped up and he kind of looked at the floor and shuffled his feet a little bit and he said, well, you know, it really wasn't easy down there and there was lots of temptation and it was hard in order to earn my way here, and if you send me back, he said, I'd really like to be a stud. Poof, it's gone. Well, in 2 weeks it opened up, so Peter summoned the angel Gabriel and he said, we have two people down there ready to come in now. He said, the first one is going to be pretty easy to find. He has a 5-foot wingspan and he's soaring at 3,000 feet over the Grand Canyon. He said, now that second one's a little bit more difficult. He said, I turned him into a 2x4 and he's on the floor of some condominium in California. Which also shows that predictions don't necessarily come true. What I've described, obviously, is not a new task, and it is the same task, ironically enough, whether you believe the flaw is leaders, whether you believe it is institutions, or whether you believe it lies with us. And it lies in perhaps a simple change of our philosophy, which is a renewal of one that's been around a long time. I'm reminded of it because of a very striking talk I had at one time with a Native American woman who looked at me and said, Mr. Frohnmayer, your people have not yet buried enough ancestors. You've only been here 200 years. We have been here 7,000. When you have buried enough ancestors, you will learn to treat the earth with reverence and not to destroy it. A similar sentiment is found in that wonderful letter sent by John Adams to his wife Abigail during the Revolutionary War, when, after all, only a third of the people were on the side of the revolution. A third were neutral and a third were actually Tories. And in writing Abigail as to why he was doing what he was doing, he said, you may tell our friends that I study war so that our children can study business, law, commerce, and invention, so that their children can study art and poetry and music. And that sense of personal responsibility for those unborn, that sense of what lawyers call trusteeship, but which is trusteeship in a much larger meaning, is certainly not unknown to our culture. There are many roads to Rome, obviously, but the governor must know where at least some of them are. There are no risk-free solutions in this business, and we must all be risk takers. We have to reward creativity and excellence as never before, and we cannot be too sleepy or too scared to do it, because one thing is certain: no one from the outside will do it for us. In 54 AD, the ancient Roman poet Juvenal wrote the oldest and yet still the most contemporary question about government. And recalling the Latin from my 9th grade years, it ran something like this: Sed quis custodiat ipsos custodes? But who will watch the watchers? Who will guard the guardians? The answer, if we are to build Oregon's future, is it is we ourselves. Thank you very much.
And now, if there are any questions, we'll set up a mic in the center of the room. Questions may be posed by members of the City Club. First question is from our board host today, John Frohnmayer.
I'd like to ask the first question, but as I was buying my ticket, I saw Bill Scott, and I sold the right to him. And then as I was going through the food line, I saw Karen Whitman, and I sold the right again to her. Notwithstanding that, Dave, you mentioned loss of civic values and the difficulty in motivating students, and the surveys that show that perhaps a whole generation of students has been lost to civic service. My question to you is, when you were governor, after you sat down in the chair and tried out the phones, what would you then do to motivate the us? That is, not the leaders, because the leader would have changed, not the institutions. You told us how you're going to do that. But what would you do to motivate the private citizen to make sure that that citizen helped assure that Oregon continues to be a great place to live?
I think the question is easier to answer in Oregon than in almost any state, because at least the starvation for participation in this state traditionally is unlike almost any other I've ever seen. There are more than 2,000 Oregonians who sit voluntarily on boards and commissions on their own volunteer time that other states pay money to professional civil servants to do. I think what it is simply a sense of direction. The governor has to be a catalyst. The governor has to be prepared to have some black and blue marks, and so do those with whom the governor tangles. If I had it my way, I might well be a one-term governor, but the risk would be worth it. I don't sense any lessening of the desire for a state that has a sense of direction really in any generation. The worry that I have about the particular one that I mentioned is its apparently strong desire to have someone else do it. And that, I think, is the great task that we have for that generation emerging from our higher education institutions. But judging by my mail and by the street corner comments, I don't sense any diminution of the desire for civic participation amongst the balance of our society. I think what it needs is a catalytic force to bring it together along a single path. That's obviously not easy. It's not easy, and it may mean enormous amounts of frustration, because we can't all win all the time. But it's happened before in this state, and I see no reason why it can't happen again.
Yes, at the microphone, and please identify yourselves.
Yes, my name is Wynn Wakala, and I am a member of the City Club's Standing Committee on Law and Public Safety. My question is, does the current parole system adequately address the problem of a parole violator who needs drug or alcohol treatment rather than incarceration? And if not, how would you remedy this situation?
I don't think that the problems of those particular offenders are adequately met, because I don't think that we have adequate community resources to do it. And one of the points that I made, if it came out at all, is that obviously once one has identified this as the serious, compelling problem that it is in terms of the likelihood of future violence, that puts it much higher on the rehabilitative agenda. One of the great problems of the parole system, of course, is that because there is not adequate space for even the most serious of offenders, many times, many people are released prior to the time when they're, in the judgment of corrections professionals, ready for it. That is a problem more serious that relates to the adequate capacity of our system.
Herb Crane, a member. My question is quite simple. What would it take to get you to mail a copy of your speech to Neil and Norma?
The answer is 44 cents, and I'll do it.
Diana Godwin, City Club member. David, you mentioned the importance of reforming our school finance system. The City Club is just going to be undertaking a study of Oregon's school finance system. Can you offer us some of your thoughts on how we can reform the school finance system? I think we all agree that until we do that, it's going to be difficult to get on with our other tasks of building on our existing economic resources if we don't have a stable school system.
Well, I was going to turn that question around and say the first thing I would do on a program for school finance is read the City Club's report on that subject. You know, there's something ugly about the way that we finance the system now, as you all recognize, and that's irrespective of where you stood on the ballot measure that we last dealt with. And that is that it does pit the elderly against the young. It exacerbates a generational rift. Oregon is or was the 9th highest property taxation state in the country. And there's something obscene about a system in which we still are worrying in this state as to whether or not 4 or 5 school districts will close their doors, notwithstanding a state constitution that says the state will provide a common and uniform system of schools. A safety net proposal of some kind is a minimum. I suspect more school district consolidation, and we've made great strides on that in the past, is one of the answers. Frankly, I think that if we do all of the things that we can do in the economic growth area, then even if the Oregon public, for its own reasons, does not accept a 3-tiered taxation system, that we may be able to generate revenues that will take us out of the woods in a few years. But we're not there yet, and in the meantime, my best wishes to you in your study.
Dave Olson, City Club member. I look at you both and think how fortunate you are to come from a strong family. And I'm glad you mentioned the kind of people that end up in prison, the abused and the neglected. And, you know, in our state where we try to provide homes, foster homes, group homes, we find that these kids move around from home to home to home. What do you think we could do to increase the stability? Give these children a sense of commitment.
That I think is the most important issue after child abuse is discovered in that whole problem. That's the problem of foster care drift. The studies, and they're grim, will tell you that if a kid has been moved more than once or twice in a period of a year, then the chance that that child will ever understand the bonding nature of love and how people communicate that way will forever be lost to that child. And so one of the major efforts in the field, and certainly something that would be on my agenda and will be, irrespective of the position that I hold, is to work for ways to end that foster care drift, and you do it one of 2 ways. And it may sound brutal, but it has got to be done within that 1-year window. You either have to work intensively with the child and the family to make sure that the kid won't go back and get murdered, or you have to be in a position of saying, we will terminate parental rights and we will put that child up for adoption to a loving and permanent home. Because after much more than that year elapses, we've lost the kid. It's a walking human failure, a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And I can document that to you, and you obviously know that from everything that your question implies.
Pete Plumridge, City Club member. As you know, Oregon is rated 55th out of 56 states and territories in its state support for arts. There are some that say the governor doesn't exercise a strong enough leadership position, and that if the governor was convinced that support for the arts was good for economic development, that the governor would take a stronger role. Do you agree? And if you were governor, would you take such a stronger role in support for the arts?
Well, if I were governor, I would still have John Frohnmayer, former chairman of the Oregon Arts Commission, as my brother, and I don't think you'd need to worry.
Charles Davis, member. Dave, I'm interested in the question of whether or not the governor in the state of Oregon is expected to do the kind of things that you would propose to have him do. My perception is that we expect the governor to be a weak governor, and we built in a system to make that inevitable, such as the role of the legislature, this board of directors that meets every 2 years, the strong constituencies that support each of the state agencies, some of which might well be disposed of. How do you see a governor bringing the leadership that would change that?
Well, the governor participates in the legislative process, although some people in the legislature don't understand that. He has a power that's spelled in 4 letters called VETO. I think it is indispensable that any governor use or be prepared to use that veto, confrontive as that is. But let's not underestimate the power of job owning and the power of the bully pulpit. You cannot account for the strength, for example, that Ronald Reagan enjoys in this country by the constituency he commands in Congress. He gets his votes in Congress because he gets them first from the folks out there. And obviously, any governor's power has to be exercised as a combination of what the Constitution gives him or her, what the legislature has delegated, what the strength of the vision of that person's ideas is, and the powers of persuasion and conviction to the general public. Sure, you're not going to do all of that in a day, but you first have to decide that you're going to do something. And having served in the legislature, I can attest to you that it is not an institution that is afraid to follow good leadership. The problem is that, at least in recent years, with this carnivorous attitude that we've had to each other because everything has come apart and budgets are cut and no one can get anything done quite right, we've turned on each other. And that process can be turned around, and the slow and heartening economic growth that we're now seeing as of this morning's paper gives me some feeling that the next governor may well have considerably more leadership flexibility than Governor Atias had in the terrible times that he inherited.
Bill Lash, member. Unless in the next 10 minutes you're going to make an announcement that you are in fact running for governor, I am assuming that you will continue as Attorney General. What of your vision that you've given today, and assuming that you are continuing as Attorney General, can you as Attorney General perhaps give to the state or to us or to help us to achieve some of the things you've described?
Well, I was, I think, farsighted enough to tell you that I would direct the Attorney General to do something that I've already started to do. On the issue of child abuse, molestation, and neglect, I have surveyed all 50 states, my counterparts in those states, in working with the Governor's Commission Against Violent Crime, which I chair. We have identified as major priorities the problems of drug and alcohol abuse and child abuse and molestation, and we have prepared and are continuing to prepare both legislative recommendations and administrative recommendations that deal with that subject. But, you know, it has to be one of those things that you call an issue of currency. I hope that something that I have said in that regard will cause you to talk to your friends about those issues as the priorities that they are. In the economic development arena, I know that we have many laws that are impediments to the expansion of existing industries and the attraction of new ones. I've done my best to do an inventory of those. My staff is acutely aware of the need to cut through needless red tape. That's something that will continue. And beyond that, any issue that deals with the legal system sooner or later intersects with my office. You have my commitment that irrespective of the partisan affiliation of the next governor of this state, I personally in the Department of Justice will be pledged to work as a team in state government. The issues are too important for partisan differences to divide us once the issues have been resolved at the ballot box in November.
Dale Annis, member. I have numerous conversations with people around the state, and one of the things that I'm constantly reminded of is that the resources, both human and physical, go beyond the Portland metropolitan area. Nonetheless, there seems to be an us versus them attitude. How can the governor address this issue?
One of the ways to address it is the one that I suggested, and that is if we simply continue our ad hoc solutions, pork barreling a little bit of economic development money here, pork barreling a little there, without giving anybody a sense of what the long-range vision is and how we're going to build and what we're going to do for each of Oregon's regions, we're simply going to exacerbate that regional strife. I mean, you've probably read about the reaction of the citizens of Coos Bay to the lottery when it first came online. That's endemic of a much more serious regional division in this state. Just to defuse the issue a little bit, though, let me remind you that it's ever been thus. As a good Medford, Oregon boy whose football teams used to play those of Portland, I can assure you that the awe and sometimes resentment against the upstate teams was pretty pronounced in those areas. We'll always have it. But I don't think I think we should take every effort to avoid exacerbating it. I was surprised in the Oregon legislature when I first joined it I thought that the issues that I would face would be Republicans versus Democrats, conservatives versus liberals, great issues of policy and principle. The biggest issue all through my 3 terms and to this day is the difference between those legislators who represent rural constituencies and those who represent urban ones. And that is simply a demographic fact, not only in this state, but every place. We just need to do everything we can to build bridges downstate and east of the state.
Carl Ingram, City Club member and member of the Law and Public Safety Standing Committee. There's been a shift in the Corrections Division toward punishment and less toward rehabilitation. What's your feeling about that type of move in terms of punishing the criminals instead of changing their behavior?
There's been a great loss of faith amongst students of the right and the left in corrections, not only in this state, but really worldwide, on our understanding of how rehabilitation really happens. In consequence of those kinds of discoveries, belated though they may have been, the legislature made that move even before the Oregon Corrections Division did, because it changed fundamentally the principles on which parole and probation were to be granted when it passed the matrix system back in 1977. I think on the whole it's sound. I think on the whole it is less likely to be arbitrary, that there are less likely to be disparities amongst those offenders who committed similar kinds of crimes in terms of the years that they serve. And frankly, there's less of the con job that happens when you go to prison, and if you decide to go through the right schooling programs and say, yeah, at the therapy, mandatory therapy sessions, you get an earlier parole date. That was a system that lent itself to deceptiveness. So I think that the fixed sentence that is equitably apportioned according to the seriousness of the crime is probably a better move for us, at least until we learn a lot more about rehabilitation than we now know.
Bill Long, question about the jails. We're going to be asked to vote, I think, on regional jails in May as something to the tune of 80-some-odd million with a debt service of $230 or $240 million. Is this an idea that you, as an Attorney General, think is a good idea, that we need some of these regional jails, and will you be working strongly for that effort?
The answer is yes to both questions. I testified in behalf of ballot measure number 5. State Representative Jim Hill, who is its principal author, spent an enormous amount of time canvassing the needs of Oregon's prison system. It has the advantage of being able to come online as it is needed, rather than having a huge bushel basket of dollars thrown at one particular state institution. And I think it is responsive to what certainly now and at least in 10 years' time will again be a need for additional incarceration space. I deeply hope that every strategy I gave you for the prevention of crime will in fact reduce crime by 50% over a decade, and perhaps in hindsight it would not have been money well spent. But I think we need to hedge our bets that much.
Sykes, member. There is an interim committee which was assigned or given the assignment to study legislative reorganization. There are many that feel that a change in our system affecting the length of terms, etc., is long overdue. At the first meeting of this interim committee, they came to the sage conclusion that since they didn't have to give an answer for 11 months, they ought to wait until much later in the year before they gave it consideration, which indicated to me that they don't take it very seriously. What is your attitude toward this whole proposition?
Well, I've sponsored one or two proposals regarded as quite radical, both then and now, for the restructuring of the legislature, both when I was a legislator and thereafter. I think the truth of the matter is that it's very hard for any institution from within itself to reform itself in a fundamental way. And in many cases, there are truths about the legislative process that it's very hard to understand until you've been there. That's one of the reasons that I believe it is essential to establish an ongoing commission on the legislative branch that includes both those who have been there, those who are serving there, and people from the outside who are distinguished Oregon citizens who've had a chance to step back and take a hard look at how well the process of the people's elected representatives is serving us. We did that, after all, 15 years ago with executive branch reorganization. 5 years ago, we established the commission on the judicial branch, and our judiciary is much the better off for it. It's time to do it to the third, and the sooner the better, because I think that's the only way that searching, honest examination of that process will happen without the inevitable pork barreling that would make it seem all things to all people but not really accomplish any fundamental change. And most important, not restore it to the rightful regard and respect in the people's eyes that it deserves if we believe in the concept of representative government.
Last question.
Jane Houston, City Club member. Dave, there's a lot being discovered now about privatization of many of the functions of government. Can you briefly give a little of your philosophy on having the private sector do such important functions as running prisons and mental hospitals and these kinds of things?
Well, I guess I start out as a basic believer in the private enterprise system. But I also look at some functions which are so intrinsically government functions that we are responsible for them no matter whether they're sold or leased or mortgaged to the private sector. I am opposed to the privatization of prisons as I understand those proposals to be. I think the issues of mental health care are different, and I would be more open and receptive to further study there. The reason on prisons, obviously, is that the state is still responsible, whether there's a riot or not. My attorneys would still be defending the liability in your tax dollars if there is cruel and unusual punishment visited on an inmate because it is so tinged with the state's responsibilities. And if the contract came up a little short, the temptation to skimp on the nutritiousness of the meals or on the adequacy of the security inside, I think, might make that a very explosive situation. I'm sorry that that's kind of a hop and a skip and a jump through your question, Jane, but it really deserves a much longer and better reply. Happy birthday, Oregon. You've been a very generous audience, and I appreciate it deeply.
We are adjourned until next Friday. Thank you.